Hope you are able to see the slides. So today our topic of discussion is data collection method. So we are discussing on research, and research involves collection of data. So we have to collect data for the research purpose. So how do we collect the data? What are the different ways in which we collect data? What are the different types of data that we can classify? So that's what is our discussion for today. So sources of data. So where do we get this data from? So the sources of data we can classify broadly three sources. The first one is the primary source. Second one is the secondary sources. Third one is the tertiary sources. So we will be seeing one after the other. So the primary source, the data that is collected through the primary sources are called as primary data. So we very often, when we are talking about research, we say that the primary data, secondary data, and even before in our sessions when we were discussing on different types of research, we were discussing on say we said that this is related to collection of secondary data. When we were discussing on exploratory research, if you remember, so there we have said that exploratory research mainly depends on secondary data. So we can do the exploratory research based on the secondary data. So what does the secondary data mean? Secondary data means that so it is collected through the secondary sources. Primary data. What is primary data? Primary data is collected through the primary sources. Okay. So what is primary sources? So primary sources, there are different sources. Say if you are conducting interviews, if you are collecting data through interviews, if you are collecting data through focus group. So we have discussed about what is focus group. You are collecting from respondents through survey. You may conduct a survey through questionnaires, right? Schedules. You may use schedule as tool of collection of data. Observation you may do. You may conduct some experiments and collect data. So all these are different sources of primary data. So the data collected through such techniques are called as primary data. So primary data is a first-hand information. So you are collecting it for the first time. So you means the researcher. The person involved in the researcher, he is collecting the data for the first time. So it was not collected before. So it is collected for this particular research only. So that's why it becomes the first-hand information. It is not collected by somebody else. It is collected by the researcher himself. And it is obviously it's collected for a specific purpose. So what is the specific purpose? It is related to the topic of your research. So if you are doing a research on employee turnover, then you are collecting data related to employee turnover. If your study is related to customer satisfaction, then you are collecting data related to customer satisfaction. If your study is related to customer loyalty, then you are collecting data about the customer loyalty. You are not collecting something else. Okay, so that is specific purpose. The purpose is very specific. Why you are collecting? So that is related to your topic. Got it? So like that. So it is with a specific purpose, and you know what to be collected through the different sources. It is raw data. Obviously, the data that is collected is not processed. It is not in the form of information. So it is a raw data, raw. So you may use any techniques, observation, focus group, interviews, anything. So once it is collected, it becomes a very raw data. Further, you have to analyze that, process that in data to bring it to a meaningful form, right? And this type of data are most authoritative. in the sense you can depend on that data 100% because you know it is collected by you. So it's reliable. You can depend on that. So that's why it is called as authoritative, the most authoritative. When you're collecting data from other sources, say in the secondary sources, you may collected data which is already there. So you don't know how it was collected, who has collected it, when it was collected. Yes, it is there. But what is the accuracy of the data? You don't know. But here you know it because you have done it. So you have collected it. So that's why it's called, it is most authoritative data. It is not filtered, it is not tampered. So there is no any editing has been done in this data. There is no any changes that is being done. So that is because you are involved in that. So you know that, right? So in that sense, no filtering, no tamper in data when it is you are doing that work. So that is about the primary sources. So already said. So these are the different examples of primary sources: interviews, focus group, panel of respondents. That is, panel, as I said, panel is a group of respondents that is fixed, and data may be collected over a period of time. So that is called as a group of respondents, called as panel. Okay. Set of respondents. Observation technique may be used. Okay. So these are the different primary sources. Then secondary sources. Secondary sources are always necessary for any research. Primary sources may or may not. It is not necessary that you will have to depend on primary sources always, but you will have to depend on secondary sources, whatever the research may be. So doing a literature survey is dependent on secondary sources. Other day we were discussing on literature survey or literature review. So how did you do that? It is through going through the various secondary sources. So through Google Scholar, right? You are browsing various journals, and then you are selecting some articles, right? That is already there. That is already collected by somebody else. So it is published. The data or the information is already published. So you are referring that. So that becomes one of the secondary sources. There are so many other sources, secondary sources. Okay? So secondary sources means which is already existing, already there. Somebody has already collected it. It is stored. It is published. Published or unpublished. It may be the data is published somewhere or it is not published somewhere. But it is already collected. So that is called as secondary sources or secondary data. Publication of central, state and local governments. There are several publications. So a data may be published in some of the publications, books, newspapers or journals, right? So who are doing this publication? It may be this government may do, central government, state government, local government. They have various publications. Each departments, they are supposed to come up with data on the population, data on the number of houses, right? Data on the caste, data on the languages, data on the gender, data on the education. Like this, there are so much of data that the government has to publish regularly, periodically. So you know that census is being conducted every once in 10 years. Census from each and every house, a lot of data is collected. So a country has to know what about its population, like how many numbers are there in each house, how many kids are there, what is their age, what is their education, parents' education, old age people in the house, right? Language that is known, spoken. So like this is a lot of information. So that is about the house, the land, local government, local authorities, a municipality, They will have the records, information about the land, right, in a particular taluk, how much area, who is occupied, what is the area, what is the land, what type of land it is they're owned, like this. This lot of information uh, is recorded and it is published by these governments, right? Publication of foreign governments. So like that, the local governments, state governments, central government, other countries, they have their own data published in their periodicals. Technical and trade journals, technical and trade related journals are there. They keep on publishing data related to their area, technical journals. So each area there are so many journals, magazines are there. Say mechanical engineering, there is so many different magazines and journals. Automobile engineering, aeronautical engineering, right? Business. Business. Okay, so business has several such publications. Trade, retail organizations, right? Any business, any trade, they will have certain publications by their association. There are normally some associations. For example, retail, they have an association. Okay, Retail Traders Association would be there. So they keep on publishing the data related to their trade. Otherwise, in general, you find publication data information in books, magazines, and newspapers. Reports of businesses. Any business, they will have to yes, right. Associations, as I said, maybe it is manufacturing industry or a particular industry, sugar industry, cotton industry, right? Like that. Each of these industries, they have their own associations and they keep on publishing every year, periodically, about the data related to their industry. Stock exchange, stock market, banks, financial institution, they have to publish data related to their area. Reports prepared by research scholars. Those who are doing research, they have to publish their findings, right? So either it is electronic form or a PDF or a hard copy, it should be there. So now it is all soft copy. It should be there in a database, whether it is a university database or institute database or whether it is a library. So they have to publish that, right? Online database. So these data are the sources for secondary data. So any research can always take data from there. So as you have collected data for employee turnover in IT industry through Google Scholar, you have searched various journals and picked a few articles, right? So that is how each article is the outcome of some researcher, right? They have done data, they have done some research. They might have depended on primary data or secondary data, whatever it is, but they have done a paper, they have done an article, they have published it. So you have referred such 10 articles, right? So reference. So you are taking it for your knowledge, right? So like that. So those are the secondary sources which is already there, which is already published, or it may be unpublished also. So that is called as secondary sources. Then tertiary sources. Tertiary sources are where some data which is not tertiary sources is an index or textual consolidation of primary and secondary sources. Sometimes what you see, the data are not that much in detail. Sometimes it should be in a condensed form so that it would be much easier to search. Something like index, bibliography, databases may not provide much textual information, but as aggregates of primary and secondary sources, right? So bibliographies. So if you see textbooks at the end, you will see index page where small definitions will be there, meaning of some words will be there, right? It will show which page number, more details are there. So that type of sources are called as tertiary sources. So now we have discussed about the primary and secondary data sources. So what is the difference between primary and secondary data? So primary data, it is real-time data. So when you are collecting primary data, it is for that time period. It is the recent data. But whereas secondary data, which is already collected, is already collected and it becomes a past data. Sure about sources of data. When you are doing the primary data, you are sure about the sources. You know from where you are collected because you are involved there. You are 100% sure about the data. But in the secondary data, you are not sure about the sources of data, though it should be mentioned. Actually, when the data, the information, like say articles, publications are done, so they are supposed to publish from where they have collected the data. So that is mandatory. But sometimes when you are collecting from the resources which is not that authentic, which may not follow the guidelines, then you are not very sure about the sources where they have collected it from. So you are not very sure about the sources of data. Help to give results and findings. So this type of primary data is mainly collected to find some result, whereas secondary data not necessary to find some results. It may be to refine the problem. You need to clearly understand what the problem is, maybe a research problem, as we have discussed in the previous sessions. So you need to clearly understand what is the problem in the research. What is the area that you are supposed to address? What is the area that you are trying to get the solution for? So how do you know about it? By going through secondary sources, secondary data analysis. So it is you are refining the problem. You're trying to understand the problem in research. Costly and time-consuming process. Primary data collection is costly because you are involving yourself. You will have to travel. You will have to spend more time, right? So in that sense, it is more costly and time-consuming. But whereas secondary sources, it is much cheaper and it does not consume that much of time. So collecting some 10 articles is a matter of maybe 1 or 2 hours. Whereas if you have to collect data from 100 respondents, it will take so much of time and cost. You will have to prepare a tool, questionnaire. You will have to meet 100 people, collect it. Each person you have to meet. Maybe it may take 15 days, 20 days, right? Depending on the research, observation, focus group, interview, any of these primary techniques of collecting data, which is more expensive and time-consuming process. Avoid biasness of response. So here, when you are collecting primary data, you can avoid biasness. Say when you understand that the data is biased, so you can use your judgment. And if you find that the data is biased, the response is biased, then you can just exclude that from your analysis. But whereas the data that is collected already and which is already used for analyzing the data, but you are not sure whether the data is biased or not. You don't know about it. In the primary data, the data collection is more flexible. Means you can change. If you find that the technique that you are adopted is not working fine, you may adopt a new technique, new method. But whereas secondary data is already collected by somebody else and it is already published, it is already there, you cannot change much, you cannot do much about it. You will have to depend on that. So in that way, primary data is more flexible, secondary data is less flexible. So primary data collection method. So we'll be seeing some more details about the different method of the primary data collection, which we have mentioned already. So primary data collection, we said that observation method is there. So we know normally when we talk about primary data, we normally think primary data is collected mainly through questionnaire only. So it is not that. You can collect, that is one technique of collecting primary data. There are other techniques of collecting primary data also. But most of the times we see questionnaire method is a one common method of collecting data. There are other techniques also. That is what we are going to discuss now. So observation method is there. Direct personal interview, indirect oral interview, information from correspondence, questionnaire method, and schedule methods. Some others also is there. Say focus group, depth interview, all that also is there. Focus group, that is not mentioned here. Okay. So observation method. It is commonly used for research purposes. So here you are collecting data without asking any question. And it may be done in natural setting. Normally it is done in the natural setting. And the data is collected very systematically in this method. It may have structured or unstructured format of observation. Visual observation is done visually. So when I am talking like this, you may not very clearly understand what is this observation method. So I'll give an example. Suppose you want to observe the behavior of people in a retail environment, a mall environment. How do people behave, a consumer behavior? How many number of people come to a shop in what time of a day? How much time they spend in a retail outlet? Whether they are influenced by any displays, whether they are any accompanies while purchasing, whether they are influenced by the accompanies may be a child, a partner, maybe parents, friends, any of these people. It may be there, it may not be there. Whether they are influencing them, what is their role in purchasing? Whether display has any influence on the purchaser. Display in a retail environment, you will find displays. Whether that displays has any influence on the purchasers, whether they see all the displays, which display, which area is more influencing. So like this, you may have hundreds of such research questions which may be really interesting to be known by a retailer, so that he can frame strategies which will help him to have better business. So I am talking about retail setup. So here you can have an observation and find out answer for all these questions that was asked. So how do you have that? Maybe two broad methods may be adopted in observation: manual observation and mechanical observation. In the manual observation, you will have a person, an individual, maybe a researcher himself may be there, or it may be a device, a CCTV camera may be fixed in one corner of the retail outlet or a mall setup, which will be recording all the movements of the customers who come there in different corners. If it is a very large setup, there will be more than one CCTV observation cameras. So all this observation is data about the movement of the customers and their behavior is collected over a period of time for certain duration. Maybe some months, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, any number of time, depends on the study. Then it will be analyzed. All this data is stored in a server if it is a mechanical observation. If it is a manual observation, the person who has observed puts everything in writing. How many number of people have visited, whether they are influenced by displays, whether there are people who are accompanying. So all these things he will go on noting down, then he will finally compile this information. So this gives an answer for retail behavior. So like such studies may be useful observation. So you are not asking anything through a questionnaire. You are not interacting with the respondents. You are just observing them and collecting the data. So that is observation method. So you are not asking anything and it is in the natural settings. The observation is being done in the natural settings. It is in a retail outlet. It is not artificial setting. People are coming and buying there. As usual, in the normal setting, it's not laboratory setting. It's not a just made for this purpose, right? Systematically collected. So what has to be observed will be already clear before doing that observation. That's why it's called a systematic, very systematic. So it is research, right? Here, structured or unstructured will be there. Structured means specifically what to be observed will be very clear. Okay, how many number of customers coming in this particular example? If it is, how many number of customers are walking in, how much time they are spending, right? Whether the companies influence their purchase, whether display influences, how much they spend on each purchase, like this specific thing. If it is there, if it's structured. If it is unstructured, means they will just observe anything and everything what the customer does in a retail store. Not very specific, right? So visual observation is being done. So that is observation method of data collection. Merits, some of the advantages of observation is it is one of the common method of data collection. It is simple method, not complicated. You don't need expertise in data collection when you are doing observation. Some knowledge is required. It is realistic. You are collecting the facts in the realistic situations. Formulation of hypothesis. Observation may help in developing hypothesis for the study. You can verify the data. The data which you have collected, you can verify it because it is recorded already. If it is a mechanical observation, so you are observing the movements of customers in a retail outlet, it is already stored in the server. You can observe that. CCTV recordings would be there. You can verify that. Or you are using a manual observation, the person who has observed already there. So you can go and cross-check it, verify the data. Greater reliability, you can rely on this data because you know how it is collected. Who has collected this data, when he was collected, everything is recorded and it is there. You can rely, you can depend on this data. Demerits or disadvantages of observation. Everything you cannot collect through observation. Customer preference you cannot collect. Their dislikes, likes you cannot record. That you have to ask them only. Through observation you cannot find what he likes, what he dislikes, their preferences, what is going on in their mind, their emotions. That you cannot observe. Right? Illusionary observation. Sometimes what you see may not be the truth. Right? This happens. Illusion. It is just illusion. You find something, but it may not be true. You may see something, it may not be true. So that is illusion. Self-conscious. When people know that there is something somebody is observing, then they may become more conscious. They are not natural. They may not be natural. So the facts may be deviated. So they become conscious. The respondents, the people who have been observed. When you say that there is a CCTV camera which is recording all the things, then you become, people behave slightly different than natural. Subjective explanation. Suppose a manual observation is there, then there is an element of subjectivity. He may present the findings in his own way, right? There is an element of subjectivity. He may not be sometimes maybe present very objectively as it is. Slowness of investigation. This takes time. You cannot do the research based on observation fast. It will take a lot of time. It is an expensive method. You will have to have either a manual observer or a mechanical devices like CCTV cameras, servers, electronic software, everything. Then it is expensive. Inadequacy. All the data you cannot collect from observation. You will have to collect some more data, maybe through interviews or questionnaire method also. So just observation may not be sufficient. Then the other type of primary data collection is direct personal interview. So in this, what happens? The person who wants to collect data is asking question with the other person, respondent, and he is collecting the data. So something like interview. So in this process, there is a motivation. So when some person is sitting in front of you or somebody is asking directly, so you get motivated to answer, respond. That motivation is there. More accurate. So this type of data collection is considered as more accurate because if some doubt is there, some clarification is there, you can get it instantly because you are speaking to that person. Supplementary information collected possible. You can collect something that is extra which may supplement the data that you really want. Something additional information also you can collect. Tactfully collect the info. You can tactfully, the researcher, the person who is doing the interview, collecting the data, you can tactfully, that is intelligently, can collect the data. So every time you may not be able to collect the data in the same way. Some people you will have to change the way in which you are asking the question. So that is called as tactfully. You are collecting the data. But when it is otherwise, other ways of observation of collecting the data, it may not be possible. Avoid inconvenience and misrepresentation. Avoid inconvenience and misinterpretation. When you're talking something, it should not be misinterpreted. So that should be ensured. And inconvenience to the person from whom you are collecting. So that has to be noted while doing the personal interviews. Disadvantage is it is expensive method of data collection. Personal bias and prejudice is there. Interviews to be thoroughly trained and experienced. The interviews, anybody and everybody cannot conduct such data collection. They should be an expert in that area. More time consuming, consumes more time. Telephonic interview. Sometimes this interview may be conducted face to face or it may be conducted through telephonic method also. So here it is, the cost is lesser compared to the face to face because you are calling over a telephone. You need not travel across. So traveling cost is reduced there. Less number of interviewer required. So as one person can cover larger area, so less number of person who interview is required. Cover larger population, geographical area. Computer aided administered interview is possible. With the help of computers, with the help of softwares, you can conduct interviews which may have list of questions that is to be asked, or recorded questions will be there, and it can be asking and recording all the responses. Less interview bias. Interview bias is less when you are doing a computer administrated interview. Contact rate is higher as you are calling the numbers, so your chance of getting more response is higher. Disadvantage is less telephone connection. Everybody may not have the telephone connection, but now when because of mobile technology, many people are having. So that may not be a disadvantage now. But some areas may be there where you may not have the network. So that may be a issue. Random sampling may not be effective. Randomly selecting the population, random sampling method that we have discussed in the previous session. So doing this type of data collection, whichever it is primary, secondary, primary, you will have to adopt a technique of sampling. So that is the discussion related to our previous session. So random sampling may not be effective. You may not be able to implement random sampling because the randomly generated number may be in a far off locations where you may not have the telephone or telephone connections. In that way, you may not be able to implement the random sampling technique for telephonic interview. Duration is limited. You cannot speak for long duration over a phone. That is the limitations or disadvantage. Illustration measurement scale difficult to use. Some of the scales of measurement you cannot using telephone. Illustration, you cannot explain a question through telephone, some complicated questions if it is there. Simple questions, yes, obviously you can ask, but sometimes you will have to explain something which may be difficult over a phone. Easily terminated, the respondent, if he is not interested, he can totally disconnect your phone very easily. Distracting physical environment, the other person may be there in his home or he may be somewhere else. So outside there is some disturbance may be there. He may be traveling, he may be shopping. So that becomes a distraction while he is responding to your questions. Indirect oral interviews. So here, indirect oral interviews, a third party is involved. So in the previous techniques, what we have said, the person who is doing the research, who is collecting the data, he himself is asking the respondent. Here, a third person is involved. A third person who is not related to the research is asked to collect the information related to the respondent. Got it? So something like some sensitive information. Sometimes some people may not be ready to give you information. Some things like say smoking habit, alcohol consumption, drug addiction, right? So this type of information, for example, if somebody asks, they may not be readily give. They may hesitate to give. Why I have to give information about my smoking habit, about my drinking habit, right? So they may hesitate. So that time what the researcher will do, the researcher will appoint a person who is close to that person, the other person, maybe his friend. So the researcher will ask this person who knows about the other person's consumption habit. How many drinks per day he will have? How frequently he drinks alcohol? How frequently he smokes? How many number of cigarettes he smokes in a day? So this type of data may be collected through his friends. So that is called as indirect oral interview. So this is adopted when direct response is not possible. Sometimes directly you cannot ask some matters. So that time you'll have to collect data from the other person who knows about him. Example I have already given: alcohol consumption or cigarette consumption, drug addiction. So here the person who is the third person, who is called as the witness, he should be a person of integrity. That means he should be not disclosing this matter to other peoples. So if he is knowing about consumption habit, alcohol consumption, he should not go on publicizing that about other people, right? So that's why it should be integrity of the person is important. Ability of the interviewer, so asking sensitive information. So here some techniques should be used by the interviewer. So views from others also is collected, may be collected from more than one person also it may be collected. So these are the different techniques. One more is there, information from the correspondence. Some correspondent may be adopted to collect the data, and this correspondent transmits the information that is collected to the central office. So normally newspaper collects the news that will be published in newspapers through correspondents, reporters, right? So you see that in a newspaper, each area, each locality, each city, there will be reporters. So they will be providing the information related to their area, geographic area, to the head office, and they will compile it and put it and print it in, publish it in newspaper. So something like that, information from the correspondence. Then finally, we'll be discussing on questionnaire method. So this questionnaire method we'll be discussing in the coming session. If you have any doubts, you can ask